Good morning, everyone. We have lots of folks joining. We are going to give it until exactly 2 p.m. here on the dot. So thank you all for joining, and just hang tight for a couple more minutes and we'll get started.
Hello. It is 2 p.m. in the Eastern Time Zone, so we are going to go ahead and get started. I'm Kathy Shepard-Jones with the Human Development Institute at the University of Kentucky. The University of Kentucky, University of Alaska Anchorage, and Utah State University are partners on the Mental Health and Developmental Disabilities National Training Center. And we are so proud to bring you our 5th webinar today, titled Sick and Tired of Being Sick and Tired, People of Color, Disabilities, and Mental Health. This topic is extremely relevant given our national climate, and we're so appreciative to have Morenike Anawu speaking today to bring more knowledge and awareness to this unique intersection. Today's webinar is part of a wide array of offerings available through the National Training Center. Please continue to visit our social media and our website, which is available at mhddcenter.org, for resources related to mental health, disability, and COVID-19. We have a very large crowd today, so please reach out to let us know how we can support you. It is my pleasure to introduce our presenter, Morenike Anawu. Morenike is a global self-advocate, educator, and disabled woman of color in a neurodiverse, serodifferent family. A prolific writer, public speaker, and social scientist, Her work focuses on meaningful community involvement, human rights, justice, and inclusion. Marenike is the Innovation and Digital Communication Director for the Autistic Women and Non-Binary Network and a member of several disability executive and advisory boards, including our own MHDD Center Advisory Board. She can be followed at marenikego.com. Now, before we get started, Danielle is going to review a few housekeeping items and then turn it over to Marenike.
Good afternoon or morning, wherever you're joining us from, everyone. And thank you, Kathy. My name is Danielle Augustine, and I will be the moderator for this webinar. So quickly, we have a couple housekeeping items that we wanted to go over. If you are joining us on Zoom, the controls that we will be using are the chat box, the Q&A, the hand raising feature, and the captioning, all of which should be at the bottom of your Zoom window. We ask that you use the chat box to relay any comments or technical issues that you have for our team. We ask that you use the Q&A feature only for questions. We're going to have two different spots within the presentation to have questions, one halfway through and then one at the end. So these questions will be read aloud. We also do have the hand raising feature, which can also be used if you have a technical issue, and one of our team members will reach out to you in the chat if you do raise your hand. We will also be using the polling feature actually as well at the bottom. So a small window will pop up in your Zoom window when we get to that point in the presentation, and we'll ask a question of the audience. So you can choose not to participate in the poll if you're not comfortable or able to do so on your device, but we do encourage you to participate if you are able to help engage in the presentation. Everyone is muted and has their cameras disabled for this presentation, so you don't need to worry about muting yourself or turning your camera off. This webinar is being live captioned, so in order to access the captioning, at the bottom of your Zoom window, you'll see a CC, closed captioning icon. If you click on that and click Show Subtitles, that will show the captioning at the bottom, and you can also change the size of the caption text if you need to make it larger by clicking that same CC button, and then by clicking Subtitle Settings, that will bring you the menu open for the Zoom settings and allow you to choose a larger font if necessary. We are streaming this live on YouTube and Facebook. So if you are joining us on one of those two platforms, thank you for joining first of all. But if you have any questions or concerns, please put them in the live chat comment section on the right-hand side of your screen. This webinar is being recorded and will be available for future viewing at our YouTube channel and our website. Again, that is mhddcenter.org, and that has also been placed in the chat. Lastly, we'll be sending out a follow-up email after this live webinar with a post-evaluation. And we ask that you please complete that so we can learn how to improve our future webinars. And also included in that email will be instructions how to get continuing education credit if you need or signed up for those. So without further ado, I will hand it over to Marenike, and I will stop sharing my screen and let her share her slides.
Hi, everyone. Just wanted to let you see my face shortly before we begin, and I'll have it up as well when we're doing the questions. So I'm going to share my screen so that you all can see the slides that we'll be working with. So everybody can see? I hope.
Go ahead,
No?
click on the desktop window that you need. You might need to do that.
Yeah, I think you're right about that. All righty. Hopefully that will work.
Yep, so we can see your whole desktop view. So if you want to make
perfect.
your,
So let me just move this over and minimize this. All right, so, and thank you everybody for joining us for this webinar. As you can see, the title of it is Sick and Tired of Being Sick and Tired, People of Color, Disabilities and Mental Health. I am Marenike Giwa-Onaiwu, and I'm happy to be here on behalf of MHDD as well as the Autistic Women and Non-Binary Network. So this presentation, it was inspired by Fannie Lou Hamer's words from the 1964 speech at the Democratic National Convention. So we'll be talking about past and present concepts about mental health. The three learning objectives for this presentation are for you to understand relevant historical and current context related to minority mental health, describe mental health and related issues that are pertinent to people of color, and identify culturally sensitive mental health resources. This is a link that if it says morenikeGO.com/projects/accessibility. If you go to this link in about 24 to 48 hours, there will be image descriptions and so forth, as well as the slides. I typically do these manually. I was experimenting with this tool that does auto generation of, the images. And let's just say it's not the most accurate. So I'm just going to do it the old school way. So if you are a person that would prefer to have those image descriptions, because this presentation is pretty image heavy, that will be available for you at either the link on the top or the Google Doc link. Thank you. So as you've been told, this is being sponsored. This webinar is one of several that have been held over time, and more are to come through the Mental Health and Developmental Disabilities National Training Center. So this is a collaborative center that was formed in 2018, and it's designed to improve mental health services and supports for people with developmental disabilities. And so they're on social media. This is their web address, but they're on social media at MHDD Center. That's how you'll find them on Twitter, on Facebook, Instagram, etc. So I encourage you to follow them. So the first thing that I want to do is talk about what I usually call my 5 C's of accessibility. So, and I want to do that by first letting you know that I have an image of a beach. And if you notice, it's wavy because it's actually a picture of a shower curtain, but I just loved the water and I just had to use it rather than using a traditional picture. So we're together virtually. So whether you're like the gentleman on the right, chilling in your PJs, but you look professional on top, or whatever your circumstances are, I just welcome you to be comfortable while you're in this space. We're going to be together 45 minutes, 60 minutes, however long this takes. And so my 5 C's of accessibility are: be comfortable. So if you need to stim, self-soothe, move, whatever. I've got a stimming device in my hand now. It's a mini slinky that I use. If you want to connect or communicate with people, you've been told how you can use the Q&A feature, chat feature, raise hands. If you want to share things with people outside of this webinar, share things with people on social media, colleagues, you're more than welcome to do so. I ask that we are considerate of others. So everyone has different communication, access, and safety needs. And so I just ask that we be cognizant of that when people are communicating with the Q&A feature. I want to encourage you to challenge yourself to listen and learn. So giving a content warning, there's a lot, because we are talking about mental health, there's going to be a lot of things in this presentation that are pretty intense content. We're going to talk about physical, emotional, sexual assault. We're going to talk about ableism, disenfranchisement, incarceration, substance use, suicide, racism, homophobia, transphobia, STIs, eugenics, reproductive injustice, loss of parental rights, and public health disparities, all types of things. These aren't easy to hear about, whether you're a person of color or whether you identify as white. The material is sobering. So I just challenge you to listen, learn, and I ask you to commit yourself to grow and change. That's the 5th C. So this is July, and it's BIPOC, Mental Health Month. And so, oh my goodness. So I am so upset. I need to move this slide because it actually just gave the answer to a portion of the next poll. So I'm going to ask if we could, we're going to do a poll and then I'll resume this next slide. So I would like to ask you all to contribute. You can see the polls on the screen. The questions are, it says, I often use the following term, BIPOC, BAME, POC. You can answer more than once. We just want to kind of see. And there isn't a wrong answer. Once we have all the results, I'll just kind of share the rationale why I'm asking this question. I see about half of you have voted. Keep on voting. We've got about 30 seconds, I think, left. consider this your way of being participatory. And so we've got about 58 people who have voted so far. And I know there's always going to be some people who don't vote, but I'm going to wait a little bit more because I'm going to give you all some peer pressure in hopes that some more people will vote. Okay, so I see a few more votes trickling in, but I will go ahead and proceed. I'll leave this up on the screen for a moment. So the question was, I often use the following term. And so we have BIPOC, which is Black, Indigenous, People of Color. We have BAME, which is Black, Asian, Minority, Ethnic. And we have POC, which is People of Color. So according to the poll that we have of the 309 people who voted, 310 now, thank you, the majority of people do use people of color quite a bit. Next is the, people use BIPOC. That's, I hope, how it's pronounced. I'll be honest with you all, I see it in writing a lot. I've never actually said it aloud. And then the term in the middle is used more frequently in the UK than it is here. But so it's a term that is kind of a catch-all term. And there's two reasons why I wanted to do this poll. I'll continue talking while this is up in case a few other people are voting, but there are two reasons. The first is that terms evolve over time, and sometimes people aren't certain what to use, and they're not trying to be offensive, but they just aren't certain what to use. When I was born as a little girl, and I'm an Xennial, basically, so in between Generation X and Millennial. So, I was born and my birth certificate says Negro on it. All through my elementary years of school, it had, Black on it. And then when I got a little older, it became Afro-American. Then it became African-American, which it pretty much still is. And, there are other terms that have evolved through the years as well for other groups. I've also found that there are some people who don't understand that people of color doesn't mean Black, because essentially people of color is anyone who is of a, racialized group. So that could be Asian, that could be Desi, that could be, Latinx, multiracial. And so a lot of times, because there was a time that the word colored was used to refer to Black people, people don't understand that when we're talking about people of color, it's holistic. So although I am a Black woman, I am not only speaking from the perspective of a Black woman. This information that we're going to have on this presentation is going to be about people of color in general. So I'm going to minimize this quickly. And so I wanted to share that this month is called BIPOC Mental Health Month as of this year, but it has been around since 2008. And the former name was the B.B. Moore Campbell Minority Mental Health Awareness Month. So some groups have decided that they would prefer to use language that doesn't use terms like minority and majority, and just uses terms that are kind of a little bit more descriptive. But basically, B.B. Moore Campbell, I'm not certain if you're familiar with B.B. or not, but she passed away in 2006 of brain cancer, but she was an African-American female author. She wrote a great deal of books, mostly fiction books, and she was also an advocate for mental health. She actually co-founded the Los Angeles chapter of the National Association of Mental Illness, and was very outspoken about a topic that wasn't talked about a lot in the Black community. So she wrote a children's book in 2003 called Sometimes Mommy Gets Angry. She also wrote a book called 72 Hour Hold in 2005, which was depicting a family where there was a need for an older young Black teen to get mental health inpatient services that they could only serve her for 72 hours at a time. And so just the difficulty that the family had trying to address this matter. So BB was a major and passionate advocate for special needs, but particularly for mental health because of the fact that it impacted her life personally. So on this page, on the far right corner, this is B.B. Moore Campbell. This is B.B. Moore Campbell's daughter here, Maya, and this is her granddaughter, Alicia. This is a picture of the more modern release of 72-hour hold. It was a New York Times bestseller. If you look very carefully at this image, you can see that it very much resembles Maya Campbell. That's because Maya is the relative that Bebe Moore Campbell referred to when she stated that there was someone in her family that was having mental health challenges and they were trying to support them. She wanted to not disclose her daughter's condition without her daughter's consent, but after her death, her daughter has spoken out. Maya has bipolar disorder, and in addition to that, she struggles with substance use. To this day, actually, she was, in the media a month and a half ago with an incident that happened. And so there's a statement that Bebe Moore Campbell made when talking about mental health. Bebe Moore Campbell was trying since 2005 to have this month nationally designated. Unfortunately, again, she became ill with cancer and was not able to proceed, but there were many other champions for mental health who decided to take up the cause, after her death, and it was officially designated by House Resolution 134 in 2008. So 2020 basically is making the 12th year of this national month. And so one thing that Bebe Moore Campbell said about mental health is that, quote, stigma is one of the main reasons why people with mental health problems don't seek treatment or consistently take medication. People of color, particularly African Americans, feel stigma more keenly. In a race-conscious society, some don't want to be perceived as having yet another deficit. And so this is an observation that Bebe Moore Campbell made, and you'll see that it's kind of a theme throughout this presentation, that basically mental health stigma exists for everyone. So it doesn't matter if you're white, doesn't matter if you're Asian, if you're Black, if you're Latinx, it exists. But when you are already living a life where you're marginalized because of aspects of your identity, it can feel like one more layer, one more hoop to have to, to jump over, or another thing to have to overcome. So that, as I mentioned before, this presentation is inspired by the words of Fannie Lou Hamer at the Democratic National Convention in 1964. She uttered these iconic words: "I'm sick and tired of being sick and tired." And so Fannie Lou Hamer, along with other people such as Harriet Ann Jacobs, Audre Lorde, Bell Hooks, and other Black female luminaries and scholars, have been talking about what it's like to occupy multiple social categories and have this, this fluctuating relationship between oppression and privilege in one's life. And so Fannie Lou in particular was a granddaughter of slaves, was a sharecropper herself. And during the civil rights era, she's mostly known for her voting rights and her civil rights activism. She was, unfortunately, in registering to vote, she lost her job as a sharecropper. She was, laid off. She was shot at numerous times, harassed, assaulted, targeted, as well as other colleagues in the region where she lived. Unfortunately, there was a time that she was unjustly arrested. She was returning from a voting workshop that was out of town. She was stopped along with the other group of people by police officers who assaulted them publicly, beat them, and then they took them into custody. And the entire night, the police officers, who were white, as well as the prisoners in the police station, openly beat Fannie Lou Hamer, as well as some of the other people who were there. Fannie Lou already had a disability and was permanently disabled in a different way from these beatings, and described it in this manner: "They beat me till my body was hard, till I couldn't bend my fingers or get up when they told me to. That's how I got this blood clot in my left eye. My sight's nearly gone now. My kidney was injured from the blows that they gave me in the back." So this is what trying to exercise the civil rights that she had by law did to Fannie Lou Hamer. So she was tired of racial discrimination. She was tired of gender discrimination. She was tired of the treatment that they received that was so traumatic simply for their skin color in the place where they lived. Unfortunately, what Fannie Lou Hamer suffered in the 60s still occurs today in a different form and has occurred throughout life. So if people of color have a disproportionate amount of inequities in a variety of ways that lead to mental health, struggles. So racial trauma can be described as mental and emotional injury caused by encounters with racial bias and ethnic discrimination, racism, and hate crimes. So this race-based discrimination detrimentally impacts not only individuals, but also whole communities. And prolonged incidents of racism can actually lead to symptoms that are similar to post-traumatic stress disorder. It might manifest as depression, anger, recurring thoughts of an event, self-esteem, physical reactions such as chest pains, insomnia, your heart racing, hypervigilance, low self-esteem, mentally distancing oneself, and compartmentalization. It's very tragic. And so in the words of Fannie Lou Hamer, is this America, the land of the free, the home of the brave, where our lives are threatened daily, simply because we want to live as decent human beings in America? So we're going to talk a little bit about we're going to go a few more minutes, and we're going to talk about some of the historical context of all of these things with regard to different ethnic groups. And then we're going to take some questions, and then we're going to continue. So one of the more obvious, and sordid parts of the history of this country is slavery, essentially. Chattel slavery was what was utilized in the United States and other Western countries. It was different. Slavery in some type of form or servitude has existed in every racial group, and it's unjust and it's wrong, period. However, if we have to categorize the type of slavery that occurred in sub-Saharan Africa, in Middle East and North Africa, and some of these places, was quite different than what was experienced when people were brought here or purchased for, or stolen for slavery, in terms of the physical violence, in terms of the emotional, toll that it took on people and being less of a person. It was quite awful. And, from beatings to rape to being sold, having your name taken away, just every type of disenfranchisement you can think of. And so on the left, there's a slave who is being beaten by an overseer. And often the whips that were used for animals with metal tips buried in the leather were used on people, even on children. Other situations where one's children, one's siblings, one's spouse could easily be sold at any time, and you didn't have a right to visit them, or unless you had an owner who would allow for you to do that. You worked long hours with little food. You were not allowed to speak your native language. You were not allowed to practice your customs. This individual on the far right, this is a picture of Sojourner Truth when she was younger. Most of the pictures of Sojourner Truth are when she was older, and she's known for being a suffragist as well as an abolitionist. And, she has a poem a statement that I love. I often read in speaking engagements, "Ain't I a Woman?" where she talks about the fact that being a woman and being Black and has not afforded her whatever privileges that some of the people seeking women's rights who were not people of color were enjoying at the time. Some other things, so we have Harriet Tubman on the far left, who was also abused, had suffered migraines and headaches throughout her life. And then on the far right, we have Phyllis Wheatley Peters, who was actually, if I remember correctly, the third woman ever and the first African-American woman to publish a book in the United States. So Phyllis Wheatley was multilingual, spoke multiple languages, was a very talented poet, traveled as far as Europe to share her poetry and to read it, and was, a very, very intelligent woman, and was freed by the family that, that had purchased her when she was a young girl. She suffered poor health, but despite the fact that she was an award-winning poet that was known internationally, at the end of the day, she was still just a Black woman. And Phyllis Wheatley had been disabled since she was a young girl, which is why she didn't do a lot of hard labor, like, or field labor, is why she was able to learn these languages and kind of be in the house because she was disabled and had some health challenges, and had, a family that was, benevolent as one can be in those times. Phyllis Wheatley married a gentleman named John Peters, and they struggled with, health challenges themselves, both of them, as well as their child. And this woman, Phyllis Wheatley, had to go work as, as a maid, despite the fact that, again, she was a poet who had sold, many, many editions of poetry. And so she died of starvation and illness, as well as her child. It doesn't matter if you were the, whatever status in life you had, you were Black, you were little more than nothing. There have been a number of injustices that have been done to the Indigenous populations throughout the years, too many to name. Though in this picture, I'm just simply showing some of the images before children were, taken away from their parents. So among other things, such as, slaughter and treaty violation and being forced into reservations and so many other, really egregious forms of discrimination. One of the things that was done to the Indigenous community was an attempt to, quote unquote, civilize the children. So often children were taken from their homes. The lighter ones were sometimes just adopted into white homes and didn't know about their background. The others were put in places to westernize them and change them and make them more like, a white person, basically. So they lived in these schools, these boarding schools, and they were only able to see their families, a very minimal amount of times per year. And their hair was cut. They were given Western names, learned about Western, culture, and they also got the Western diseases. So they were living in, when you live in congregate care, as you can see in this image, if you were able to see this image, these are the separate towels and flatware that the students used. As you can see, all of these towels are touching one another. So given that the conditions were not very sanitary, there were a lot of, infectious diseases that occurred and a lot of premature death that occurred in these youth whose families sent them away for school. So it was very traumatizing for many families. And so unfortunately, at some point, when it was no longer profitable to have the boarding schools, these schools were literally, changed into, sanatoriums, or so places for where you go for health care and where you reside there. And the conditions were absolutely atrocious, far from sanitary, far from, being a place where anyone would want their child to be at any time. Other groups were discriminated against. It was, and there was discrimination against white people as well. There were signs that said Irish and dogs not allowed, or, Polish people were discriminated against, or if you were working class. So it isn't that if you were white, you didn't experience any form of discrimination, but the most blatant forms of discrimination were reserved for people of color. So as you see, if you can see the sign on the left, it says no dogs, Negroes, or Mexicans. Another sign, and these are all actual signs that used to be posted publicly: no liquor served to Indians after sundown, no colored allowed. And then we can see the separate but unequal water fountains, the white water fountain and the colored water fountain. We can see clearly that they are, one is newer, nicer, more well kept. And that was the same thing, whether we're talking about the segregated hospitals, the segregated schools, the segregated, neighborhoods. It was never equivalent at all. And even in the so-called shared settings, there were segregated entrances, segregated exits. So if, for example, you would enter the bus in the front, pay, and then you had to go through the back and you could only sit in a certain place. Maybe you could go to the movie theater and you could only sit in the balcony, and things of that nature. So it was just, that was the norm. That was life. I see a raised hand. We'll be pausing in just a moment for questions, but I won't. But thank you, Jennifer. I won't forget about you. Quickly, I just want to talk about, the Asian community has faced, the Asian American community has faced a lot of discrimination as well, many types. One of the more obvious and, ones is the internment of Japanese Americans, literally born and raised in America, who were forced into what were essentially concentration camps. Horrible conditions, a lot of death. They were very under-resourced. There was blatant discrimination in the media. And, you know, it was just a very awful period. And even after it was over, some of this persisted. And again, this is just one community within the Asian American community, one of many. It's not the only one that has faced discrimination. Lastly, before we go to questions, I just want to talk about, again, there's been lots of discrimination in the Hispanic Latinx communities of lots of forms, from immigration shaming to, you know, name calling, all types of things. But this in particular, the No Mas Bebé in campaign, basically young women and teens and girls were forcibly sterilized. And you know, and it was done on a broad scale in California as well as in other places. And often they would say, oh, the excuses that were given, oh, the person has no legal parents, or they're emotionally unstable, they have a low IQ, or they already have children. And often not, you know, none of those things were actually the factors. And many times there were parents and guardians, but they didn't speak English well enough to understand the forms. And so people lost their ability to have the choice to be, you know, to bear a biological child if they so choose because of these things. So we're gonna stop. We'll come back to Tuskegee in a minute. We're gonna take some questions. I saw, I believe, 2 hands, and then there might be some others. And so I'm not sure who's gonna help me facilitate the Q&A, but we can take it now.
So our first question, and a couple people asked this in the chat, is if you could just briefly review at the beginning. You talked about the 5 C's of accessibility. So
oh, yes,
all 5 of those. If you could
sure. And these are just something that I personally created for myself. And so the 5 C's of accessibility that I use are comfort. So I ask people to, if they want to self-stim or move, or what they need to do to be comfortable in this space, in this setting. Connect and communicate. So that's it, whether it's through text, you know, using technology, hashtags, the chat feature, or people who might be where you are. Consideration is the 3rd one. So we want to, you know, be considerate and honor people's needs and differences and opinions, and, you know, have communication in a respectful manner. Challenge, we want to challenge ourselves to listen and learn, even when we're hearing something difficult. You know, you might be watching something and be like, well, dang, you know, feeling really horrible about what your people have gone through, or what a group of people have put another through, or what have you. We still want to listen, even when it's hard. And then lastly, we want to commit to growing and changing and being better, because we all can grow, we all can change, we can all be part of the solution. We don't have to perpetuate these problems.
Great, thank you.
Sure.
And then we have a question in the chat, and I'll just kind of paraphrase, but it's essentially there we have someone asking about how you talked about the Indigenous children being taken from their families and kind of forced into that Western culture. And the person is asking essentially, and I think this can go for any sort of cultural appropriation, of what was the justification, and you may not know the answer to that, but the justification for forcing those Indigenous children to be more modernized or part of Western culture?
And that's a good question. And there's a lot of reasons, and, you know, from the things that I read. So it varied from sometimes it was geographic location. So if the families were isolated and it was difficult to get to their children to school, they would use truancy basically as parental neglect. Sometimes they would use poverty or joblessness if a family had multiple children as justification for taking the children away. In some cases, it was done in a more clandestine manner. Some of the families were not aware that they were going to lose custody. They were of the impression that, okay, I'm retaining custody of my child, but my child is going away for schooling, for, you know, more opportunities, and will come home, you know, holidays and, you know, what have you. But they didn't realize that they were, you know, in many cases, they would be considered having abandoned their children because they didn't, you know, come or see them X amount of times. You know, so there were some tricks, you know, things that happened there. Sometimes things that were used if a family was struggling with, substance use, addiction, or, various things of that nature. Or if there was a single parent, some of these were used as well. It was just really a free-for-all. And that's part of the reason why the Indian Child Welfare Act exists today, so that essentially if a child that I believe is 25% or more, of, Indigenous heritage, there's a preference, a strong preference for them to be adopted by a relative or someone of their ethnic background before another group is considered.
Thank you, Marinike. And we have another question, which goes along again with a lot that you talked about the definition of quote unquote colored. We have a person that said, are you aware that even today there are areas in the world where Jewish people are called colors? She said her daughter lived in South Africa and was advised of this. Have you heard of this before? And she said this just happened in the recent history.
It's really interesting because I won't profess to know a lot about this at all, but I do know that in some of the circles that I'm in and some of the boards that I'm in, there are some other people who are Jewish, and we've talked a lot about the Jewish community is, as we know, not a monolith, and there's a number of people who might be perceived as white, but are not, and so, and I'm not talking about like anti-Semitism in that capacity, but I just mean that, if a person's a Sephardic Jew versus, and another, branch, and the fact that the Jewish diaspora has had to spread so far to so many different places, South America, throughout, the different parts of the world. And so I think that, I wonder what the rationale for it is. I know in South Africa, colored means something different, so I know there are people that would be considered Black here in America that would be considered colored in South Africa. So it's odd if they're going by, I'm wondering if they're going by phenotype of certain Jewish people, or if it's just simply because of lumping people together as a group. Certainly Jewish people can be of any race.
Thank you. And then we have a couple questions before we move on and continue with content that kind of go along the same theme. About one person was saying how for people of color, how mental illness is often considered deviant or criminal behavior.
Yes.
And another person was asking more about, considerations and ways to support African-American seniors specifically, but just in general around mental health services. Okay,
you are absolutely correct. And a little bit later, I'm going to talk about some of the statistics and some of the, kind of how basically mental health has been criminalized, in a lot of communities. So that's a very astute observation. With regard to specifically African-American seniors, there is going to be a place near the end of the presentation. And it's also that I'm sharing some resources, and I've also put them on my website for anyone that might want them. So I've got a slide where I have a link to them. I can say it aloud quickly now if anyone wants. It's just to remember, it's my name. So marinike.com/projects/multicultural-mental-health resources, but I'll be providing it to where you all can see it later. It has a variety of different resources for mental health and people of color. I know I have some that are age specific, like for example, there's some there for youth and for college students. I don't know if I have anything specific to African-American seniors, but there are some things that are just kind of overall general resources, and hopefully maybe some of those might be helpful.
Wonderful. So there are still some questions, but we'll move forward with content and we'll make sure we get all those questions answered. So I will let you continue on, Marinike.
Sure. So in this slide that you see, we're talking is the, essentially Tuskegee experiment, which most people are familiar with. The United States Public Health Service, and it went on for, I believe, 40 years. And so people were not given, the right to have true informed consent in terms of what was really being observed, and the impact that it had on them and their families by going untreated, having their syphilis untreated for years and years, and so sadly, the justice, quote unquote, was served when this came out, in the early 70s. when this came out, and as an expose, there were, after trying to obfuscate and lie about it, when the government finally admitted it was the case, the amount of money that they gave to, for quote unquote damages was just ridiculous. It was an insult compared to what, people had suffered, the losses they had had, and their descendants. It was basically a slap in the face. And for this to still be happening, so, in a modern, quote unquote modern period, was just really disheartening, for many people. Tuskegee, as well as, some other horrible things that, in worldwide history, not just American, such as what happened in the Holocaust, et cetera. A lot of these are reasons why we have, formed a lot of the, ethics and, boards, and we have the institutional review board process to try to have more ethical research, where people have a choice, and where people who are from vulnerable groups are not coerced into research and are able to have their questions answered and leave at any time and not feel like that there's going to be retaliation. So just wanted to talk about, like I said, there's so much that could be talked about. Like every one of these slides could be its own presentation. There was so much information that, but I unfortunately am going to have to make sure that we get through it all. I'm going to have to move on. That was just an overview of some of the more, common forms of historical trauma that have been faced by people of color. So trauma has various forms. I'm going to talk about a few of them right now. Regardless of the form, they all have lasting impact. So there can be direct traumatic stressors, which is something that essentially can happen to any person of color. It's the direct impact of living in a society where structural racism or individual or racist attacks are something that can happen. So maybe this is something that has actually happened to you. Or maybe you're impacted in a direct way, such as you live in an area that's heavily policed. Maybe you're unable to purchase the type of home that you want because there's inequitable, policies for you. Maybe you're unable to get certain jobs because your name, or because how you're perceived. Maybe you get stopped when you try to fly in the airport because someone thinks you're a terrorist because of, that your skin tone or what have you. So you're experiencing something directly that has happened to you that impacting you because of your difference. It could be microaggressions, it could be physical, or verbal attacks that you face, and people don't mean it. I remember, if I had probably like $1 for until like maybe recent years, for every time that some person said, "Oh my goodness, you're so articulate." And I think I am kind of articulate, actually, but obviously the word has been weaponized because they're surprised. I'm a Black woman. I'm not supposed to be able to, I guess, have the capacity to express myself well. I've even had jobs many times in my life. I've shown you, those of you who had the video on, I've shown you what I look like. I'm very obviously a Black woman. I'm dark skin, very ethnic features. My name is ambiguous for some people. It's hard for them to kind of gauge where it comes from. It's clearly not an American name, but it maybe doesn't scream African to people, although it does to me when I see it. So there've been many times in my life where I've applied for jobs, and there was maybe like a phone or a screening interview that I did, and it went well, and then you come in for the actual interview, and it started to be almost like a joke where I would sit in the waiting room and I would wait for the person would come, and they'd look around and they'd look around and they'd look around and they'd look around, and maybe they go to the receptionist. "I'm sorry, has anyone come and said that they're here for the 10 o'clock?" And I'm just thinking, this is so funny. And so eventually when it dawns upon them that it's me, their eyes widen, and you can just see the surprise, like, "Oh God, she's Black? She didn't sound Black on the phone," or whatever, like, "Oh gosh, I wouldn't have given her this job if I knew, or I wouldn't have brought her in," but hopefully by then I feel like I've halfway won the battle. But it's just sad that that's even the case, and there's so much research about, there's been research about how people with names that are perceived as ethnic names, be they names that are perceived as African-American names, or, Latinx names, or names that are perceived as Muslim names, and therefore could be a variety from various different ethnic groups, are discriminated against. So getting out of the direct and going to vicarious. Vicarious traumatic stressors are those that are more indirect. So these are things that happen as a result of systemic racism, things that happen, create mental health issues because indirectly, even though you are not necessarily always personally affected. So this can be, for example, there's, video. So social media is a place where some people have vicarious triggers because of the fact that you would never know at any moment if you pull up a thread or, that someone has posted, that you'll see a video of someone that looks like you being, kneed in the neck or being, choked or beaten or shot, while running away with no weapon or what have you. So these are things that are very traumatic. There's also experiences. So there are a lot of youth of Hispanic Latinx descent who have vicarious trauma about immigration. These are people who are US citizens. They are born and raised here. But because they know of what is the impact of what is happening to so many people in their community, it's just so stressful, or witnessing someone else, or knowing of someone else who's had some type of, immigration situation. It can cause vicarious traumatic stress. This is something that also happens a great deal in Native American communities because there is a high rate of suicide and unintentional injury, particularly those who live in reservations, which tend to be more rural areas. There is also transmitted trauma. So these are things that have been transferred from one generation to the next. And so most of the research on this has been descendants of the Holocaust survivors. These are people who they've found that the survivors have displayed an increased vulnerability to psychological disturbances because of the stresses that their ancestors faced, because of the horrific conditions and the discrimination and the violence. And injustice that their relatives faced. So this is something that has also occurred in Native American communities with massacres and forced violent removal from one's land, loss of language and culture. In Native American communities, you can still see there's a predisposition for some people toward depression, substance dependence, diabetes, because of this lasting trauma. Similarly, you can see that in some groups in the Pacific Islanders, the Marshallese, for example, have that from the nuclear testing. We see generations later, there's still an impact emotionally and physically as well. And so there's beginning to be a growing body of research about the sustained collective trauma of the Black community because of imperialism. So, colonialism that occurred in various parts of Africa and in the Caribbean, and then chattel slavery for those who were here in America, and then Jim Crow, and just on and on, to where we are today. And so these are some of the things that people have faced. And so we've talked about it in general. So if we talk specifically about mental health, and I'm not going to be able to spend as much time as I would like in this, but on this, but it's quite important. So in the instances when a person of color was clearly, displaying symptoms of a mental health diagnosis or was diagnosed with one, we know that the treatment for mental health was pretty barbaric, regardless of what race you were, for quite some time in this country, and it still needs a lot of reform, in my opinion. But it certainly isn't what it was then. So the asylums and institutions and treatment facilities, that would restrain people and not allow them to, have regular communication with their families, and didn't allow them to be, integrated into the community, for activities. These were, and over-medicated people, and a lot of experimental treatments that were not evidence informed. And so all of these were things that were being endured by people who had mental health diagnoses of any color. But if you were a person of color, it was even worse, because in some cases you weren't allowed in the facility. So maybe you're mentally, you've been admitted and they're getting a stipend fee from the government, but maybe you're sleeping literally in the yard or the outhouse, or the, or in a separate wing that doesn't have walls. Maybe you are in a facility that's for people of color only, and there's no running water or no electricity. There was a case of a school for youth of color who for 13 years did not have, electricity or running water, or, despite the fact that that was something that was quite common. We were in the 20th century at that point. So even in the mental health, so you're already had quote unquote a strike against you for being a person of color. Then if you were known to have a mental health condition, it was even worse. A lot of times people were taken and they had to go work in the poorhouse, and they had to kind of work off things that were not done to people in those asylums who were white. Just a great deal of discrimination as a whole. And so there are things like, so there are certain mental health conditions that even today, people of color are more likely to be diagnosed with. And we'll talk a little bit about that later. This isn't an actual ad from a pharmaceutical company for a medication, because it was considered quote unquote a Black, illness, even though it's not, it's something that anyone can have. So the ads, as you can see, it's a very stereotypical image of a Black male. And then on these ones, you can see they have African masks and whatnot. So to advertise these medications. So it's just, blatant discrimination and really, horrific. So aside from the fact that so we move forward, we talked about the forced sterilization that happened to Latinx women. So if you were, things were very challenging for the people who were known to have mental health conditions or developmental disabilities. So this is a picture of two young girls who were sterilized against their will, ages 12 and 14, because no one wanted, they wanted to make sure that these girls did not, I guess, procreate and pass on their, crazy Black genes to other people. And so these are real life people. And these are things that were happening, and there's, little consequences for those who do these things. With regard to youth of color, so speaking of youth, we talked about the 12 and 14-year-old, there's so many statistics about how a youth of color with disabilities are less likely to graduate from high school, have disproportionate rates of school punishment, especially out of school suspension, are more likely to be given a label such as emotional disturbance or a conduct disorder or oppositional defiance disorder, as opposed to, maybe something that might be more accurate, such as, developmental delay or autism. So they're more likely to not get adequate accommodations in college as well. There's just so many statistics. There's a quote here that I have from Felisa Thompson, who is a Black disabled woman, a social worker and writer, who said, if IDEA is not fully enforced, the children hardest hit would be disabled children of color, because they already have lower, there's already suboptimal outcomes, and as the slide on the left says, people are often misdiagnosed and placed into special education. And actually I won't have time to get into it, but there were some slides that there were some stats that I had about the states that did not want to integrate. And so the year that states were forced to integrate their schools, there was one school, automatically 77% of its students went from being in general education to special education automatically, because that was their way of trying to make sure that, okay, we might have to take these, people of color in our schools, but we're not going to have them in our classes with our white children. So other forms of discrimination. So, mental illness is, mental health condition, psychiatric disability, it's a disability. And there's a lot of ableism in society. So no matter what color you are. So, but especially if you're a person of color, it's worse. So the parental rights of disabled families, white and people of color, are often at risk. And so it's even more heightened if you are a person of color, and that has been the case for a long time. There's a really great resource called Rock the Cradle from the National, it's in the resources, I apologize, it's from the NCD, but I can't remember what it stands for. Might be National Coalition of Disabilities, but I'm not 100% certain. So in this country that we live in, Robin Powell is one researcher who does a lot of things about disability, parenting rights, and there's other centers, but in 35 of the US states, and I apologize that N is gray, so it's hard to see it where it says termination, but in 35 states in America, disability can be included as grounds for termination of parental rights. So you've got a couple that's divorcing, one parent has a major depression or has a personality disorder or what have you. This could be taken into account, whether or not they will be able to have, equitable custody of their child because of this. And I'm sorry, I need to go back one more. In 10 states, so those 35, disability can be considered along with other factors. But there are 10 states in the United States where you can have literally no allegations of abuse or neglect of any sort, but simply the fact that you have a disability is grounds for termination, in those 10 states, and which is awful and still the case. With regard to the criminal justice system, there are, a number of different mental health conditions that people have. It's the same with the juvenile justice system. And I have to unfortunately go a little faster because we're running, I know we don't have a whole lot of time and I have a lot of slides, so I'm just going to try to cut the material. But I put this slide up here because even amongst our allies or even amongst our own, we still use stigmatizing language. So this slide at the bottom, it says 1 in 4 Americans suffers from a diagnosable mental health disorder. Minority populations are less likely to receive diagnosis for their behavioral health issues and have less access to mental health services. So when I see terms like suffers, endures, those are, there is a mad pride movement with people who talk about the fact that this is part of their neurology and, and people shouldn't be stigmatized for having mental health, conditions. It's a diagnosis like anything else, like diabetes, like arthritis, like anything that one could have. And so, even in our own words, when we're calling people sufferers, what are we implying? So quickly, I just want to talk about the fact that the US is a very, very diverse place. There's a lot of people of color. There's people who, whether a person of color or white, who have, heritage from another country. We have a number of people who have, diverse gender identity and or sexual orientation. And so just share quickly with regard to that, I wanted to share a few things about some of the screenings that have been held in some of these communities. So, when we talk about people of color, that includes people who are biracial, multiracial, multicultural. And so a lot of times people forget that if you are of more than one race or more than one culture, you are still straddling, a fence where you're, where you might be torn between what's happening in two different cultures. So you might have, privilege on one side and then you're marginalized on the other, or vice versa. So they found that in, that there's a slightly higher risk of alcohol and substance use, anxiety, eating disorders, major depression, and psychosis in people who are, when you're looking at someone who's multiracial, biracial, as opposed to someone who is just monoracial. It isn't that, it's basically because it's another layer. And they've also found if, people who are LGBTQ, the rate is even higher than their straight peers. So whether it's their straight peers who are also people of color or their LGBTQ peers who are white, there's a higher rate of anxiety, eating disorders, stress, and all of the higher diagnosis rate as well. This is all a mental health issue. The racism is a mental health issue. And it's not just a race issue. It's not just a Black thing, a white thing, or anything like that. It's everybody's thing. It impacts all of us. And I'm going to talk a little bit why. So I'm going to talk about one thing that's pretty sobering, which is suicide rates. From 1991 to 2017, the suicide attempts in Black youth increased by 73%. In just the last decade, the suicide rate, completed suicides in Black youth, have nearly doubled. It's increasing faster than any other ethnic group. It's even more sobering when you look at in our Asian American and Asian Pacific Islander groups. So if you are between the ages of 12 to 19 years old, suicide is the leading cause of death if you are an Asian American or Pacific Islander. And that's something that people don't think about. There's people talk about, the model minority and all of this other pressure. There's tons of racism and microaggressions that people face, that isn't, that is ignored. Even in the beginning of this pandemic, there was a lot of racism that, a lot of people were facing who are of Asian descent. Sadly, in 15 to 24-year-olds, Asian Americans who have been here, who were born here one or more generations, it's the leading cause of death for them as well. And so it's just very, very sobering. It's also a leading cause of death for Native youth between the ages of 10 to 24. It's actually the second leading cause of death Their suicide rate is 2.5 times that of the national average and is higher than any group. Even higher when you look at it proportionally than that of the Asian American because of, the smaller numbers. And even in the Latinx community, although the suicide rate is lower than other groups, it is increasing, literally has increased 22% in the last 10 years. Sorry, I hit the wrong button. So essentially, whether it's, one's gender identity, sexuality, one's serostatus, we need to validate racial trauma. It's not just, oh, here they go again with that stuff. Oh, my ancestors had it hard too. No, these are things that are, factual and research based. So if it's ableism, if it's, body shaming in terms of size, if it's, ageism, transphobia, what have you, these things, if you have all of that and you're a person of color and you also are struggling with your mental health, all of these are things that impact you. So we have to normalize these things. We can't ignore these things. There's so many things like the quote unquote strong Black woman or the stoic Latina, fiery Latina or whatever. Those things are not, we need to be cognizant of our own mental health issues. We shouldn't silence or patronize others for their trauma, nor should we bury our own. We need to normalize mental health. We know that we go to the doctor for screenings, we go to the dentist, we go to the optometrist. This shouldn't be treated any differently. It's important. And so some of the ways that it can be normalized are, there are celebrities that have spoken up about their experiences with mental health. So we've got Black, Indigenous, Latinx, South Asian, multiracial, Middle Eastern, and North African, Pacific Islander, and so on. So I've got images of different people from Bollywood to Hollywood, art, religion, activism, K-pop, R&B, sports. All of these people have spoken up about their mental health challenges. But it's not just about celebrities. We also need to ourselves, and everyone is at a different place in their lives. So for some people, it is not safe nor advisable for them to disclose about their mental health challenges. I have started in recent years to share about myself. And so this picture I selected because when I was 11 years old, 11 and 12 years old, I kept a suicide journal. I would write out the different ways, pros and cons of the different ways to die, and why this one would work over that one. And, okay, this one will be painful, or I don't want, my body, my parents to find my body and be traumatized. If it's bruised in this way or what have you. I was diagnosed with major depression at age 12, and I've had other psychiatric disabilities since then. Therapy that we attended wasn't really designed to address, my needs. And so there was a lot of stuff that was misunderstood. So some of the things that I do to try to, be cognizant of my own mental health is I advocate for myself. So I do go to therapy, I do take medication, but I also, in that I have mental health conditions as well as a developmental disability. I'm on the autism spectrum. I carry things with me. So this is an image on the left of my backpack. So sometimes I might have days that I can't really socialize. So I have my socializing buttons. I have my pronouns. I carry earplugs because I never know when I'm going to be in a situation where it's going to be overwhelming. I have stimming devices and things that I can get sensory input from. This on the far right is a picture of my purse. I carry a small purse, and so in it, these are some things that I carry with me in case I need them. Sometimes I don't need them. Sometimes I'm fine. You just never know. And so I've pulled them all out. These are more earplugs. These are my smaller travel stimming things that I take with me. And there was a time when I wouldn't do this because it looks weird or whatever. And now I don't care. I need to do what's best for me. Other things that I do is things that I enjoy. I love Steven Universe. I love Dragon Ball Super. And so I've started to embrace that if these are things that make me happy, it doesn't matter if I'm an adult. I don't think these things are just for kids. I think people should be themselves. And then there is and then regular people, everyday people like myself, again, and like these individuals, Dior Vargas is a feminist Latina mental health activist. And because of the invisibility of people of color, she created an art project. This is the website. It's also in the resources that I'm going to show you. And so it's basically about different faces of people who are people of color who have, mental health conditions. And so one thing that Dior said was, there are tons of articles that list people with depression or other mental health challenges, but you rarely see anyone who looks like you. We need to change the way this is represented. This is not something that we need to be ashamed about. We need to confront and end stigma. This is not a white person's disease. It is a reality for many people in our communities. And so these are just a few of the numerous faces of people who are featured on that website who are trying to end stigma, you know, with regard to mental health. And so they're taking their steps. This is a link. I mean, there's going to be 2 slides right after this. I have a lot of different resources, but it'll be too much for you to write down. So if you go to this link, which is the one I mentioned before, which is on my website, morenikeGO.com/projects/multicultural-mental health. I'm sorry, -mental-health-resources. It will link you to a list. Here are some of them, of a number of different resources that I think are helpful with regard to cross-cultural mental health, that I hope that you'll consider, you know, reviewing and possibly using some of these for yourself, because it's important. And so it's important that you take care of yourself. And so I'm going to end quickly with, there's a poem, I won't read it now, maybe because I don't want to keep everybody up. There's a poem I wrote in February, a personal one about some of my thoughts that I don't want to hold everybody up from that, but I do want to show a very, very short clip of a video from a project called Project Mistag. Mistag is a play on the word stigma, and it's created by Yael Harberstein, who is from Canada, and is trying to basically end stigma using a video campaign. And so she has interviewed people from different parts of the world, and asked them questions about mental health. And so there's like a 30-second ending clip of mine that I'll show, but I do want to also share these 2 quick quotes. Audre Lorde says that caring for myself is not self-indulgence, it is self-preservation, and that is an act of political warfare. Caring for ourselves on mental health is important. There is no honor, there's no benefit in, you know, holding it in, you know, and imploding and falling apart. And Bibi Moore Campbell, who again is the person who was this month, Minority Mental Health Month, was named after, said, when we finally stop asking America to love us and we begin to love ourselves, we will prosper. And so I'm going to play, hopefully, this video. Okay, yay, it looks like it's working. Sorry, the captions didn't come on, so I'm gonna start again. I thought usually they would start automatically, so I apologize. This is just, again, 38 seconds of an interview that I did about mental health and myself. So this is just the end part of it, and then I'll stop them. If any of you can stay for questions, I know we've gone over a few minutes, I apologize, then you're welcome to. That's not supposed to happen. Sorry, everyone. All right, so essentially, this is the end of my presentation. These are the photo credits, references, and then this is just a slide of, if you are interested in contacting me, you don't have to, but you're welcome to. If you, you know, just want to connect, my website is morenikeGO, that's short for Giwa Onaiwu, morenikeGO.com. My email address is mgo@morenikeGO.com. I'm probably not very naughty when it comes to being regularly on social media. I could be sporadic in terms of getting on, but my handle on Twitter, the way I can be found on social media, is @morenikeGO. And then I also have the information here for the MHDD Center. I know that some of you attending are getting CEUs. And so there's going to be some information about your post-test that you'll get shortly. But I just wanted to provide you their website and their email address, info@mhddcenter.org as well. And that's all I have. So I'm going to stop sharing and allow for the staff to come on and do their portion.
Yes, thank you so much, Marnika, for sharing. And first thing that I want to say, which we hear you and we agree, is there's a large call in the chat for you to come back and continue this conversation. Everybody's saying how, both sides of what you talked about, the historical piece is really important and enlightening, but then also the mental health side of things. So we'd love to have you back. And everybody who is still on, if you can note that in the post-evaluation test that you would like to see Marnika come back on, that will help strengthen our argument to get her back here with us. So before we open the floor up for questions, here are some links and we'll put them in the chat. I know a lot of people have asked about where they can watch the webinar, and we have a lot of other resources as well related to this. So our main website, as Marnika said, is mhddcenter.org, where we have our webinar archive, and we're MHDD Center or MHDD National Training Center across the board on all social media. YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, all that jazz. We also do have online learning modules. So if you want to learn a little bit more about disability and mental health, please visit that. We have a wonderful digital storytelling series where folks like Marnika actually is involved with one of them with Yael Halberstam, what she talked about, where folks with this lived experience tell their stories as a way to raise awareness. And then we also have a wonderful podcast as well around these conversations. So all of this you can find at mhdcenter.org. And then we also invite you to our next webinar, which is on September 17th at the same time, 2 to 3 p.m. Eastern. September is Suicide Awareness Month. So we'll have two wonderful presenters, Leah Smith and Kara Ayers, who are going to be doing a presentation titled Preventing Suicide Through Empowerment of Youth with Disabilities. So that link to the registration will be sent in the follow-up email along with all of the wonderful resources that Marnika has talked about throughout. So we'll make sure to work with her to get you all of the links to the resources that she mentioned throughout. And now we will open it up for more questions. We will stay on as long as Marnika is willing to, and as long as you all have questions that you continue to ask. So please feel free to stay on as long as possible. Let me pull up my Q&A here. Okay. Let's see, lots of great questions. Just a couple logistical questions that we can get out pretty quickly. Some folks just wanted like names of specific people. There was a social worker, Marnika, that you referenced, Dr. Thompson.
Yes, Valisa Thompson, and her website is Ramp Your Voice. Really, I can't remember if it's .org or .com, but she's on Twitter. She's, she is a really amazing person. There's another one also, I believe it's Angel Miles. Both of them, in terms of talking about the issues with youth of color and some of these other aspects. They're just really, really engaging writers and speakers.
Wonderful. And then there was another person, you talked about a couple different types of trauma, and they just wanted to repeat those if you have.
Yes, and I'm gonna have to go to my notes for that if you all don't mind, so I don't have it memorized. Okay, so I talked about direct traumatic stressors. And so that's something that impacts you directly, structural racism that, because of the society you live in, or having incidents that occur as well. Another thing is the vicarious traumatic stressors. So those are the ones that are more indirect, that's systemic racism or acts. So those are some of the examples of, having, the empathy that one has because of, immigration issues, even if you know personally that you aren't going to be deported, it still is traumatic for you as a person who's a part of that community, or, the videos of, of racist violence that occur, seeing names trending. I know I get traumatized when I see a name because it's a hashtag. I'm like, great, it's somebody who died. It's almost never like some nice story, like, someone who ran a marathon or something. And then the third one is transmitted traumatic stressors, and that's the generational one. That's the one that impacts groups of people over time, like with the Holocaust, like with the Native American community, African American community, and so forth.
There's another question, which I think is something that a lot of people kind of wrestle with themselves. And I think this can be applied to any minority population, whether that be people of color, people with disabilities, etc. But there's an individual that said, I'm always sometimes afraid to approach somebody or initiate a conversation because I don't want to say the wrong thing or make somebody upset. So do you have any advice for people in those situations as they continue to learn?
That's a good question. So I think that it's, and one can get really conflicting information because sometimes you'll see people will say, ask, find out. And then they're like, don't ask, educate yourself, find out for yourself. It's kind of like people are like, okay, which one, and sometimes you have to, so sometimes I found that that when one can develop a connection or a form of a relationship with someone, that kind of can help bridge the gap to where people, I think, are more forgiving of, faux pas or of, someone not understanding something. If you're, kind of looking at the person as a person, not negating, their neurology, not negating their race, because it is a part of who they are. It isn't the only thing about them, but it is an aspect. So not looking at it as something to overlook or overcome, but, really, I think some of the ways that a person can choose not to, I guess, will have a greater likelihood of being less offensive is being specific. So I think, for example, instead of someone saying something like such and such is low functioning, or whatever, why don't you say what you mean? Such and such needs, needs, a great deal of support, has an in-home care provider, is non-speaking, uses types to communicate, or such and such has an intellectual disability, or, like say or if it's a race, like they're, that's why I wanted to ask about the use of people of color versus BAME and, so forth, and BIPOC, because of the fact that it isn't, there are some people who are not familiar with the term people of color, even, they might be a person of color, but because the word has often been used to mean Black, I'm like, if it's Black, say Black or African-American, and often you won't know. So sometimes you can try to see, how is the person referencing themselves? Is there any indication of that, of how they talk about their diagnoses or their racial background? If there isn't, are there any cues that you can find about what might be the community preference? Is there something that's kind of a neutral term, or is there something you can use that's a combination term? I live in Texas, Hispanic is used a lot. When I lived in California, Chicano was used a lot more. And now, we're using, Latinx as opposed to Latino, Latina, but some people prefer one or the other. Sometimes you can say more than one at a time. Sometimes it would be too long. So I think on both sides, those people who are learning and gaining and are respectful in the way that they ask a question, I think that, and then I think on the other end, those of us who answer the questions need to also be gracious, because no one's going to always get it right. There is no one preference, and even in one group. So it's hard to read the situation to sometimes, I would say sometimes, I'd say probably more often than not, it would be okay to ask. But in some cases, that is going to be seen by a person as a microaggression, as, emotional labor, as being singled out. And so it's pretty complicated. I'm sorry, I can't really give like one answer, but I think a question that comes from the heart, that's genuine, that isn't otherizing, will be, even if you're incorrect, or, will be treated with more grace. When I talk with people, for example, if someone will say, one of my sons has intellectual disability, and someone will say something like, oh, okay, so your son has a low IQ? I'm like, no, my son has intellectual disability. I will politely, correct it. Don't call him a person with a low IQ. Don't call him the R word. I will, say it back the way that I'd like it to be referred to.
Great, thank you. Another person asked earlier in the webinar, and they said, do you think that this, and by this, I think they meant the historical injustices, is a reason why there's such a large inequity for mental health treatments and stigma for people of color around mental health?
Oh my goodness, yes. If I had more time, there was so much that I couldn't put in here. There were there were things some of these things I knew, but there were some things that I did research that shocked me that I hadn't learned about, that, was just, it was just really surreal. And I really, so, although I know there are other factors as well, there are current things that are going on, we haven't gotten a chance to talk about, insurance and the socioeconomic factor. And then of course that in some cultures, the stigma about, my family is from, West Africa, although I was raised here in the United States. I'm of Nigerian and, heritage, Yoruba and Cabo Verde, and my family. And, that's like, you're not supposed to be like, that's like, you need to pray more, if you're having mental health illnesses, or that's a spirit, or that's, something that somebody put on you. And I know, like in other communities, they may say, oh, that's ojo, or what have you. You're just, not supposed to, it's just, there's such complications. So there's a historical factor, and then there's a current factor, and they both intertwine and create a very challenging situation for a lot of people.
Mhm. Absolutely. So someone asked more of a personal question with your experiences of what has helped you to be aware of what you need and be prepared, social emotional intelligence of sorts.
So a lot of what has been challenging for me is, and has worked. So I've made mistakes. So sometimes I've learned what works for me by not doing what I had been doing. And so a lot of my life, I suppressed a lot of things. And I believed I had that, take one for the team mentality, that, I would, my feelings were not really that important. What was more important was harmony, was the greater good. And so I had very much a martyr syndrome, but it was, fairly intrinsic. And then I also had a lot of difficulty with that I didn't realize at the time with compartmentalization and disassociation. And then I always rationalized things. So if someone did something wrong, I could not see them as a villain. I could sympathize with them, but to the point where you're almost enabling. So it took a lot of pain and really, deterioration, to where it was impacting my life and I could no longer busy myself away from it or ignore it, to where I finally had to realize that, what I was doing wasn't working and that I needed to try something different. And so I started very small. So, I think about how people say, love yourself. And I remember when I would think, love myself, I don't even like myself, so I had to start. So I started with gradual steps, in terms of, okay, I'm going to try to hate myself less. And then it progressed to accepting myself, liking myself. And then it might, then it started becoming to developing a sense of love about certain things about myself. Then I started to try to stand up for myself, not because the thing was really a big deal, but because I wanted to be for other people. I thought that it was a better example. So sometimes it wasn't the best reason. But as I started to learn what worked for me, I started to really lean into it. So one thing that I've started to do in adulthood is like, so I always used to, want to look, very serious and, mature and, responsible. And that I have that part of me, but I also have the part of me that's just fun and silly. And so I felt like I was just going to be my whole self, and regardless. So I spoke at the UN the year before last, and I wore a dress, but I wore some boots because that was more comfortable for me. I had a stimming device with me. I've just tried to, I feel like it's better for me. There's a movie, The Talented Mr. Ripley, where he talked about most of his life, he thought it would be better to be a fake somebody than a real nobody. And I think that neither of those is right. I don't think you should be a fake someone. And I don't think the real you is a nobody, but I do think the real you is flawed, has, strengths and has challenges. And we just have to learn to grow and lean into that and continue to improve ourselves. It's a really individual process. And I think it's an ever evolving one.
Thank you for sharing that personal experience. We have a person that's asking, and I think this is a great question, of how do we really view or interact with services that, claim or maybe present themselves as culturally competent when we
But
know
they're
that
not.
most, exactly.
Oh, yeah, that's a huge pet peeve of mine as well. And it's almost, basically, I've almost found that if something, deems itself culturally competent, it usually almost never is. Um, and so sometimes it depends on, so, there are some larger organizations that kind of pay lip homage, lip service to being culturally competent, and they'll throw a few things in there, like peripherally or, particular time of the year, and then it's away. And so I think one of the ways that we can do that is to continue to bring these issues up. So when people talk about their cross-cultural this, or they try to shove you to this corner, finding areas where it overlays. So maybe there's an issue. So they've got their cross-cultural resources here in this little box, but maybe they're talking about learning, things about learning, or self-regulation, or something of that, or other things that, compensatory skills, and finding a way to bring up, an aspect that's, kind of more, I guess, central to a person of color or another marginalized group, to kind of counter that, because that's maybe over here, you're talking about this thing, but you're not talking about anything else, and about the other realms of a person's life.
Great, thank you. Another person asks, you talked about suicide rates in Black youth, and they're asking specifically how much in the last decade has those increased, or what kind of knowledge you have around that?
Yes, there was an actual number, and I feel.
Oh, sorry, you got muted there.
I was muted by accident. So I might have, I know I have the number in another set of notes, but I believe it was, it went from 2.2, I'm sorry, 2.5 per every 100,000 to 4.83 for every 100,000. I've got to double check, but it was something close to that. And that was as of 2018, sorry.
Mm-hmm. And then this last question, we have someone that's asking specifically if you're familiar with an organization called TAPT, which still in Oklahoma, which it seems from what this person is saying, still markets using very outdated terminology of folks of people of color and disabilities, and saying that they really need a lot of historical research. So I'm gonna kind of frame that question of how do we go about educating not only individuals, but maybe advocating for organizations to become more culturally competent and learn about the historical injustices.
Okay, so the first thing I want to say is, unfortunately, I'm not familiar with the organization. I did write the name down so that I can try to look them up. And I do have a few colleagues who are in Oklahoma. I don't know if maybe any of them, have any familiarity, but, just kind of, shoot an email and say, hey, could you check this out? Because sometimes things, people are a little bit more receptive if it comes from, like a peer or someone, as opposed to a stranger. But I think about something that, so in the currently for many years, in the disability community, there was a huge push for, person first language, to be less stigmatizing. So, calling instead of saying someone is, I don't know, manic or whatever, this is a person with bipolar disorder, or someone's schizophrenic. No, this is a person with schizophrenia. We do know there are some conditions where identity first language is preferred over person first. We see that in the deaf and hard of hearing community, see that a lot in the autistic community, but it's different from person to person. But I think that what I've found is that groups that have had some progress with regard to stigmatizing language have made inroads by getting involved, even if just, kind of, over a period of time, not necessarily long-term, but getting involved with certain organizations. There is a woman, Jody, oh my goodness, I cannot remember her last name for the life of me, but she's in Washington State. And she runs a nonprofit organization, until recently, called Redefine Positive. And so the reason why Jody Howerton, I think is her name, she was realizing that the sexual education material that was used at the school, the entire school district, was extremely archaic. and stigmatizing in the terms that they use, the imagery. And so she went through the conflict resolution process of making a formal complaint, and they just were defensive. And so eventually she joined like an ad hoc group to kind of go to some of the meetings and work with the people. And then so she found that this stuff had been created a long time ago. And this is, basically limited resources, people just keep reusing whatever has worked. And so she realized that some people were open to a new resource, they just didn't have the capacity to develop one themselves. So, being a very resourceful person, she sought some support, from, external parties, and was able to get some grants and some crowdfunding, and was able to kind of, get some contract with some, with a diverse range of groups to create some materials that were better. So now she was coming to these individuals with, look what I'm providing to you. I'm helping you advance. I'm helping you this, that way you can devote your time to doing other things that you're better at. So she kind of came at it from, it's inaccurate, and it's going to confuse people, or they're going to find other information that conflicts with this, and therefore they're not going to be able to truly take advantage of the services or the information that you're trying to give. So going about it that way, as opposed to what she really wanted to say was, are you freaking serious? This stuff is so old and stupid, and, or whatever, and, not to use an ableist term, but that's what she said, she felt. But, so sometimes it's just about the approach, kind of doing it like a team approach. I know that there are some groups, there's a group called Positive Women's Network, USA. It's a leadership group of women living with HIV and allies. And they actually have created a toolkit that they use about stigmatizing language in the media. They have a work group, and over the years, they've created kind of like almost like a template, or basically if it's an op-ed or an article or something you've read, basically people can kind of utilize those, change a few things and send those out to the editor or to a publisher or what have you. And oftentimes they've had positive results. So they've kind of done some of the legwork in terms of, what people are receptive of when you're giving them criticism, and, kind of what kind of, I guess, motivates someone to change. If you talk about their bottom line, lack of understanding, things of that nature, if you make it something that makes them feel like, oh, it's not that we're bad or wrong, but this is going to reduce our impact, sometimes they're more likely to listen.
Thank you so much, Veronica. And so we're about half hour over the fact, and thank everybody who stayed on. About half of the folks stayed on this long, so we really appreciate that. And so, like I said, Veronica, we'd love to have you back. I think everybody who was on would echo that. So anybody who, please be on the lookout for a follow-up email from info@mhdcenter.org with the link to the recordings, all the link to the resources, anything that you could want or need from the webinar, we will put on that follow-up email to make sure that you have everything. And again, thank you so much, Veronica. This was so wonderful. We really appreciate your time and your extra time on this. And I think we can chalk this up to a very successful webinar. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone. I really appreciate you staying after. And if I'm invited, I'll be back. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.